In this presentation, we are going to talk about how to calculate overtime for employees. I accidentally added more of a title onto this video presentation, but we're going to talk about piecework earnings in another one. So first of all, we need to talk about who actually do we pay overtime to. And so we pay overtime to folks that are non-exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act overtime provisions. So therefore, anyone that is non-exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act provisions, we have to pay overtime to. If anyone is exempt from the overtime provisions in the Fair Labor Standards Act, we don't have to pay overtime to. So how do we know if somebody is exempt or not? What we're going to do is we're going to look at their primary duties. So certain primary duties are exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act overtime provisions. And some examples of those primary duties that are exempt are things like executive work, administrative work, or professional work. There's others as well. But as an instructor, I'm exempt from the overtime provisions because I am considered a professional. My work requires advanced knowledge, and that knowledge was acquired through a prolonged course of instruction. I went all the way through and got my master's. Therefore, I could work 80 hours a week, and I would still not get paid overtime. And that might not be fine with me, but that would be fine with the law, okay? So anyone who does not meet these primary duty requirements, okay, who doesn't have an executive work, administrative work, professional work, they are considered non-exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act overtime provisions. So they can be paid a salary or an hourly wage. It doesn't matter based on that. A lot of people think, oh, if you don't want to pay someone overtime, just give them a salary. Well, that's not the case. You have to look at what their primary duty is in their job. So you can pay someone a salary or an hourly wage, and as long as they do not meet the primary duty requirements that makes them exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act, you would have to pay them overtime. So all blue-collar workers are non-exempt employees. So that's who you normally see as an exempt employee. Examples of blue-collar workers, there's many, but an example would be a police officer, a firefighter, an EMT, a paramedic, someone like that. Anyone that does not meet the primary duty requirements to be exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act is considered non-exempt, and you have to pay them overtime, okay? So we base our overtime on an hourly rate, okay? So, and there are actually two methods for calculating overtime. So that's what we're going to talk about next. So first is probably the method that you have seen before. It's the most common method. This is where you calculate your gross pay by taking whatever time is done in normal regular hours, 40 hours, times some employee's regular rate. And so that gives you your regular pay. And then you calculate overtime pay by taking an overtime rate, which is regular pay times 1.5, and then you multiply that by the overtime hours, or the hours in excess of 40. So let's look at an example of that. So let's say that we have an employee that works 45 hours and gets paid $12 an hour, okay? So their regular pay for their regular hours, the 40 hours, you would take 40 hours times $12 an hour. That would give you $480. Then you would calculate their overtime pay for these 5 extra hours. So first we could calculate an overtime rate. We would take their $12 regular rate times 1.5, and that gives you $18. So you calculate their overtime pay by taking the 5 additional hours that they worked overtime, and then you would multiply that by this overtime rate. So 5 times 18 is going to give us 90. So therefore, their total gross paycheck is going to be the 480 from here plus the 90 here, or 570. Okay, so now let's go back and look at the other way that we can calculate overtime. So we call this the overtime premium method. Okay, and so here what you do is you calculate gross pay on all the hours worked. So that's going to include their overtime hours. And then you multiply all of their hours worked times their employee's regular rate. Then you calculate what we call an overtime premium. And so that overtime premium is going to be calculated by taking their normal rate of pay, and you're going to multiply it by just 0.5, okay? Not 1.5, but 0.5. The reason why is because you've already used up the one part of the 1.5 up here when you multiplied all hours worked, including overtime hours, times the regular rate. So now all that you need to pay them extra is the 0.5, okay? And so the overtime premium rate is your hourly rate times 0.5 or 1/2, okay? And so let's look at an example of that. So again, our employee is working 45 hours and they're getting paid $12 an hour. Okay, so they work 45 hours at $12 an hour. So first we're going to calculate their regular pay, and we're going to calculate it this time on all the hours. So 45 times 12 is 450. Sorry. Let's get that right. 45 times 12 is 540. Okay? And then their overtime pay is going to be, and this again is our premium. Okay? Here we're going to take our 5 additional overtime hours times 12 times 0.5. And that gives us $30. Again, it's 0.5 because you've already factored in the 1. What's 1 times 12 is 12, right? And so you've already calculated those 5 hours times the 1 part, 5 times 1 times 12 in here. And so all that we need the rest for the overtime is just the 0.5. So here we're taking the 5 hours times 12 times 0.5. So that gives us 30. So our overtime premium in this case was how much? It was just 12 times 0.5 or $6, right? All right, so therefore our gross pay is going to be the 540 plus the 30, so that gives us 570. Now note that for the overtime premium calculation of gross pay, it was 570, and then if you look back at our normal way that we would calculate overtime, it's also 570. So both methods result in the same answer, okay? So as I said before, just because you have an employee that gets a salary, okay, if they are non-exempt, meaning they have to get paid overtime, then you still have to calculate overtime for them if they work over 40 hours. So just because someone's on salary doesn't mean that you do not have to pay them overtime. So if you have a non-exempt person that is on salary, you have to somehow, and if they work overtime, you have to somehow calculate their hourly rate, because what do we base our overtime on? We calculate it at an hourly rate, okay? So this is where overtime gets a little bit harder. So what we're going to worry about now are people that are salaried employees that are non-exempt that actually earn overtime, okay? So before we get into that, let's talk about some common pay periods and make sure we understand these. So some people are paid bi-weekly. So this would be where they're paid every 2 weeks. So how many pay periods are in a year? 26, okay? And so that means that each pay period, they have 80 hours, okay? Then we also we have employees that are paid semi-monthly. So here they're paid like on the 15th and the 30th of each month, so twice a month, okay? And so therefore, if we take 12 months times 2, we would have 24 pay periods, Okay, now for them, they're going to have different hours each pay period. Okay, because some weeks, some pay periods are going to have 2 full weeks of pay. Some might have more, some might have less. Okay, so then you could get paid monthly. So here, obviously, there are 12 pay periods in a year. And again, you're going to have different hours each pay period because some months have 30 days, some have 31, one has 28 or sometimes 29. Okay. And then you've also got a weekly, you could get paid weekly. Obviously, there would be 52 pay periods. And here, it's the same amount of hours each pay period, be 40. Okay. So where you get confused, or hopefully not, but what gets confusing is an employer may have different pay periods for different groups within the same company. So you might be paying some people biweekly, some people monthly, some people weekly, some people semi-monthly. So you have to keep up with all of that, and it seems like you're probably paying every day. Okay, so where it gets difficult is when we have salaried employees that we are paying overtime to, okay? Because we know their salary, maybe it's a biweekly salary, maybe it's a monthly salary, but we have to pay overtime based on an hourly rate. So somehow we've got to convert our salaried wage rates to hourly rates before we can calculate their overtime, okay? So here's where we do this, okay? Or how we do it. Okay, so here's how we do this. So first we're going to annualize their salary. We're going to calculate their regular weekly gross. From that we can calculate their hourly pay. From that we can calculate their overtime rate. And for these we are going to use 1.5. And then from that we're going to add overtime pay to regular gross. Okay? So here's how this works. First, let's look at an example. So salary quoted to a non-exempt employee is $1,500 a month. They're paid weekly, and this week they're going to have worked 43 hours in the pay period. So again, what we're trying to do is convert this monthly amount to an hourly rate. Okay? So the first thing we're going to do is annualize their salary. So we'll annualize their salary by taking $1,500 times 12, and that gives us $18,000. Okay, so that's really what their annual salary is. Okay, then what we're going to do is we're going to convert that to a weekly salary. We do that by taking $18,000 divided by how many weeks are in a year? 52. So $18,000 divided by 52 gives us $346.15 as their weekly salary. And notice that when are they paid? They're paid weekly. So normally they go home with $346.15, except for this week they worked 3 hours of overtime. So we've got to calculate that. So then to calculate their overtime, we need to keep going and calculate an hourly rate. So $346.15 divided by our 40 hours is $8.65 an hour. Okay? And so then we can calculate their overtime rate by taking $8.65 times our 1.5, and that gives us $12.98. Okay? So therefore, their overtime pay, you would take the $12.98 rate times their 3 overtime hours, and that gives us $38.94. So therefore, their gross pay, remember they go home with $346.15 each week, plus the $38.94 in overtime pay that you calculated. So their paycheck for this week would be $385.09. Okay? Let's look at another example. So this is example number 2. Okay? So here we've got a non-exempt employee, and they're paid $2,000 a month. Okay, they're paid semi-monthly, and they worked 4 overtime hours in this period. Okay, So in this case, first let's figure out their annual pay. Okay, so they get paid $2,000 a month. How many months are in a year? 12. So 2,000 times 12 would be 24,000. Notice that they normally get paid semi-monthly. So let's go ahead and calculate what they normally go home with before we continue. So their semi-monthly pay, we could take 24,000 divided by how many semi-monthly pay periods are in a year? 24, right? Okay, and so therefore they would normally go home with $1,000. Now this semi-monthly pay period, they're going to go home with more because they worked those 4 hours of overtime. So let's see how much more they get to go home with. So we've got their annual salary here. So from that, we're trying to calculate an hourly rate. So first we got to calculate what a weekly rate would be. So we'll take their annual salary, 24,000, divide by 52. That gives us $461.54. And so then we can calculate their hourly rate by taking $461.54 divide by how many hours are in a week? 40. So $461.54 is $11.54. Okay, so their overtime rate would be $11.54 times 1.5 or $17.31. So therefore their overtime pay would be $7.31 times how many hours of overtime they work? 4. So $17.31 times 4 is $69.24. And so therefore their gross pay, they normally go home with $1,000, so I've got $1,000 plus this $69.24 in overtime, so $1,069.24 is what they would go home with. Okay, let's look at another example. Okay, so here I've got a little bit different. Okay, here I've got a non-exempt employee is paid $2,000 a month for a 38-hour work week, and they're paid semi-monthly. Now, anytime they work over 38 hours, okay, between 38 and 40 hours, they're going to get their normal pay, hourly pay rate, okay? Anytime they work over 40 hours, they're going to get 1.5 times their they're going to get a real overtime rate, okay? So of 16 hours of overtime in one pay period, only 12 are over 40. So how many would be between 38 and 40? Well, you'll take 16 minus 12, so only 4 or 12 are over 40. So therefore, 4 are between 38 and 40, okay? So let's see how we would do this. So we're going to annualize the salary. $2,000 a month times 12 would be $24,000. Okay, and they're paid semi-monthly. So real quick, let's figure out their semi-monthly. What they normally go home with. 24,000 divided by 24 pay periods would be 1,000. So they normally go home with 1,000. Okay. Now we've got to figure out what they get for their overtime. So first we'll look at their weekly rate. So 24,000 divided by 52 is 461.54. Okay. Then their hourly rate is going to be 461.54 divided by 40. Actually, not by 40. It would be by what are they normally contracted to work? 38. Okay, so 461.54 divided by 38 is going to get you 12.15. And then their overtime rate is going to be 12.15 times 1.5 or 18.23. Now let's figure out what their gross pay would be. We know they normally go home with $1,000. And then what we've got is they're going to get paid their regular hourly rate for these hours between 38 and 40, which is 4. So we're going to take 4 hours times their regular hourly rate, which is 12.15. And then what we've got to do is add that to the other 12 hours that are over 40, in which they're going to get paid the overtime rate. if you do the math out, you should get 1267.36. Okay, let's look at another one like that. So here we've got a non-exempt employee that gets paid $1,600 a month for a 35-hour work week, and they're paid semi-monthly. Overtime is calculated as regular hourly pay between 35 and 40 hours. So anything between 35 and 40 hours, they still get their regular rate. And then they're going to get a time and a half for anything worked over 40 hours in a week. So here we've got 16 hours of overtime in one pay period. 6 hours are over 40 hours weekly. So let's calculate how much is going to be. So they've got overtime pay of 6, right? And so therefore their regular pay of 16 minus 6 of 10, okay? So let's calculate this. So first, again, we're going to annualize the salary. So they get paid $1,600 a month times 12. It's going to give us $19,200. So $19,200. First, let's come over here. Notice that they get paid semi-monthly again. So we'll take the 19,200, divide by 24 pay periods, and so they normally go home with $800. Okay. So then we can come back over here and finish figuring out their hourly rate. So we'll have 19,200 divided by 52 gives us $369.23. And then we can calculate their hourly rate. That would be $369.23 divided by how many hours do they normally work? 35. So $369.23 divided by 35 gives us $10.55 an hour. So therefore their overtime rate would be $10.55 times 1.5, and that gives us $15.83. So therefore their gross pay, they always go home with $800, but then we've got 10 hours that they're going to get paid that regular rate at, plus then they've got 6 overtime hours, which they're going to get paid the $15.83. When you do the math out, you should get $1,000.48. Okay, so I've got one more for you. Okay, so here we've got a non-exempt employee. Okay, and it's paid $2,200 a month. Okay, they're paid bi-weekly, and they've got 11.5 hours of overtime, okay, in one pay period. All right, so here's how, so we're back to a normal 40-hour work week, right? So we don't have to worry about what part of overtime is considered regular pay and what is considered overtime. So here, anything over 40 hours is overtime. So here we've got 11.5 hours overtime. So first, let's figure out their annual salary. They get paid $2,200 a month. There's 12 months in a year. So 2,200 times 12 is $26,400. Now notice that they're normally paid bi-weekly. So let's see what they normally go home with. So they normally go home with $26,400 a year. How many bi-weekly pay periods are a year? 26. So therefore, they normally go home with $1,015.38. Okay. So then let's come back over here and figure out our hourly rate. So first we've got to figure out our weekly rate, $26,400 divided by how many weeks are in a year? 52. So 507.69. And then we'll calculate their hourly rate. We take the 507.69 weekly rate. Here we divide by 40 because that's their normal pay or normal time that they work. That gives us $12.69. So their overtime is going to be the $12.69 times 1.5 or $19.04. So therefore their overtime pay, we can calculate They get paid $19.04, and how many overtime hours did they work? 11.5. So their overtime pay is $218.96. So therefore their gross pay is going to be the $1,015.38 that they always go home with, plus the $218.96 overtime, and so therefore we're going to make a check, a gross pay of $1,234.34.